An hour and a half?
Yeah, it's usually about an hour. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session. My name is Jody Williams. I am the Indigenous Education Lead for Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board. We're really excited today to be chatting with Morris Switzer on a really important topic. As I'm sure many of you know, that last week was dedicated as Treaties Recognition Week in the province of Ontario. And sorry, just gotta fix a little glitch. Just give me a second here. Sorry about that. And so we are continuing the conversation today. Maybe some of you know, or some of you don't know, that yesterday, November 8th, is recognized as Indigenous Veterans Day. So of course we have November 11th coming up, which is Remembrance Day, but we also have a dedicated day to learn about the important contributions that Indigenous peoples have made. That's part of why we're here to chat with Morris. So I've had the pleasure of working with Morris for several years now. Morris has dedicated his life to definitely treaty education and has been a strong advocate in getting this important information out to schools and to the new generation coming up. He's the author of several books. You may have read some of them. One is called We Are All Treaty People. The other one is called Nation to Nation, Understanding Our Relationship. And more recently, he's the author of another children's book as well. I'm not sure if he might mention that today. But I'm going to turn it over to Morris now. He'll formally introduce himself and we'll get started. And I just want to remind people for the chat box, please just use that for questions only. Just put your questions in the chat box. It is being moderated, and if there's any inappropriate content, you will be removed from the session. So I'll turn it over to Morris now. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Jody, Miss Williams, and welcome, welcome all you teachers and students, learners alike from all across different boards in Southern Ontario. I think that this morning we had a session built around a little book for elementary learners that I helped create that Jody mentioned, called Grandpa, What is a Treaty Anyway? And the answer to that question is that treaties are promises. They're legal documents, they're ethical, they have contractual implications, but at the bottom of it, they're promises. So, and we had estimated maybe 4,000 or more students involved in our session this morning. So while I usually am used to going out and traveling down to your territories and you know, and sharing information about treaties, usually to individual classes and groups of teachers and students. And so the good news is, while we're restricted to a lot of learning online, the good news is that we can reach far more people. So I'm privileged to be asked and invited by Jody and her board, and really privileged that so many of you are tuning in. So, and I hope you are saving your questions that Jody will field for me. So I'll introduce myself in Anishinaabe, in a language of my grandparents, and I'll explain what I said after. Ani bojo niji, Benezi dijnikas, wajesh dodum Anishinaabek, Angwaro dodum Odnashoni, Alderville Donjiba, North Bay and Diana, Anishinaabe and Dow. So I said, greetings, friends, niji. And I said that a name I've been given is Benesi, which is the Nipissing people abbreviate a lot of words, and that's I was told a short version of a name I was given, Nimki Benesi, which is Thunderbird. And I said that I have clans, as most peoples around the world, their cultures have ways to denote their clans, and Scottish people denote their clans by tartans, and Indigenous peoples, we denote our clans by creatures, birds, animals who inhabit the lands around where the individual nations are. And on my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marsden, you can tell by his name, Muskrat, Wajashk, that was his clan. But on my grandmother Ormanelli Franklin's mother, her name was Esther Hill from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, and I can claim a wolf clan through my great grandmother. I said that my home community through my grandparents is Alderville First Nation, the Mississaugas of Alderville, and many of you are on Mississauga territory down there where you are. Alderville, the community, the First Nation, is not too far northeast of Cobourg and Ontario. And I said that I've lived in North Bay now for about 20 years last month. And we're having a very mild spell here. For November, it's extremely mild. It's I see people running around with shorts and short sleeves on. So it's for a temperature to be 17 Celsius in 300 miles north of where you are at the end of the first week of November is really, it's welcome and it's unusual. So I saw a friend of mine this morning on Facebook said she saw a robin. So the robins are enjoying the late, some late warm days that they're sunning themselves before they head south. So that's a bit about me. And I said I'm a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation, and the Anishinaabe Nation is basically most of South and Central Ontario, and into parts of Manitoba. Anishinaabe people, you might have heard other names. I mentioned Mississauga. That's one subset of 7 of Anishinaabe peoples. You might have heard the names Potawatomi, Odawa, Chippewa, Ojibwe, and there are some Delaware people included in our nation. And nation is an important concept to understand because nations make treaties. And many years ago, what they used to call the Indian tribes, and I'm going to use that word Indian in a historic sense because that's how Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Indian people, Inuit people were referred to. We still have in Canada an Indian Act. It's important that you understand that there were nations, recognized nations of people all across what we call Turtle Island, North America. Nations make treaties, and we're making them amongst themselves before Europeans came. So I'm going to start with this presentation. And again, thank you for being here. And I'm going to say something, I might repeat this at the end. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today, I never learned in school. Your parents never learned in school, or their parents, or their parents. And it's through real positive change in the education system that these things are starting to be known. And it's too bad that it's taken this long because it wasn't the kind of knowledge that people grew up with in school. We still have a lot of misunderstandings about treaties. And if you're watching the news, you see there are big understandings about treaties on the east coast of Canada. The Mi'kmaq lobster fishers are having trouble getting their treaty rights recognized by non-Indigenous fishers to the point of where they're victims of violence and boats being burned. And those people that are doing that are breaking the law. They're breaking Canada's law. They're breaking Canada's constitution. They're breaching Supreme Court rulings that have upheld the importance of treaties. So I'm going to share with you now. And I like to start my almost every presentation I give with a quick overview of this teaching. And to do this teaching justice, it would take hours and hours, and in the hands of real knowledge holders, it might be longer than that. But this was the first Indigenous teaching I ever had many years ago, and it's very important because most medicine wheel teachings can be applied to just about any subject area you want. It's a good place to start. And of course, the four colors of the medicine wheel, the four directions, the message they carry is that everybody on Earth, no matter what the color of their skin or what culture, what they believe in, what language they speak, that we're all related. And Indigenous peoples believe we're all related to everything. Not just other human beings. We're related to everything, and that's why we're supposed to look after everything, including the land and the environment, the air that we breathe, the water we drink. So this teaching says that the Creator, God, was sending the first person to this earth and from the sky world, and he was going to give that first person. The person can be a man or a woman, however you want to tell the story. And he was going to give that person 4 gifts. And the Creator said, these are the only gifts you need to lead a good life, wherever you go. And he pointed him to the east, and there was a braid of sweetgrass, which is a plant that's used, considered a sacred medicine by the Anishinaabe people. And it was to symbolize kindness for all living things, respect or kindness for all living things. And he pointed him to the south, and there was a tree growing, and the tree, because it basically grows straight and tall, was to symbolize honesty and being truthful. And he pointed him to the west, and there was a deer, and the deer was to symbolize sharing, because deers and other creatures and plants, they're prepared to give up their lives so that others can live, so that we can live. The ultimate act of sharing, and we're into Remembrance Day week, is the being prepared to give up your life if you are a soldier defending your country or your peoples or your land. And that's why at powwows, the first people after the flag bearers that come into the powwow circle are the veterans, the warriors. And in the north, the Creator showed this person a stone. This is a big stone, it's a mountain, and stones don't appear to undergo any physical change, no matter how long they exist. And that's a different kind of strength from physical strength. That demonstrates endurance or persistence. So when we're talking today about treaties, these are good gifts and values to remember, because the treaties were about respectful relationships between people who were different. They're about the importance of telling the truth and the promises that were made in those agreements. The treaties were about sharing. They weren't about selling anything. They were about sharing the use of the land that had been occupied since time immemorial by Indigenous peoples. And the strength of the promises that were made in the treaties are supposed to last forever. The treaties were supposed to last as long as the sun shines, forever. So we'll move forward. This is the subject matter. And this is a dictionary definition of treaty. And people, when you talk about treaty, they usually think in terms of, of legal contracts. And so that's one way of looking at it. It's they are that, and for example, the country we call Canada is involved in many treaties, and this is an example of one, a higher profile treaty, the so-called free trade with the United States and Mexico. It's been renamed since then. They renegotiated it. And that gentleman in the middle, he looks like someone cheating on an exam, looking over the shoulder of someone. I hope he's not checking on how to spell his name properly, but we don't know. our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is signing that treaty for Canada. We're currently involved in treaties like the Paris Accord, by which all countries in the world agreed to take concrete action to improve the environment. So treaties have been a way of having relationships with other nations around the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Indigenous peoples were making treaties with one another long before that, because they'd been here long before. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the image that's behind me on your screen, that's a wampum belt. We'll talk about wampum belts a bit later, from a treaty between Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee peoples to end about a century of warfare. And it's called the Dish with One Spoon. And it, like so many of these amazing documents, these wampum belts, it's very simple in appearance, but very profound in its meaning. And the black image is supposed to be a dish, and in the middle of it is some white wampum beads that some people interpret as a spoon, and it was about sharing. And after fighting with one another over furs or over hunting grounds, the two big nations agreed that there was enough food in their territories to share, that they could didn't need to fight anymore. So treaties are not brand new to Indigenous peoples. And the treaties we're talking about today are, again, historically, the word Indian was used. I asked students, where did you hear that word Indian came from to describe Indigenous peoples in North America? And I was taught when I went to school that this explorer who was exploring, trying to find wealth and land for the King of Spain, named Christopher Columbus. In 1492, he set out with 3 ships and from Barcelona. And instead of ending up in India, his boats washed up on the shores of the Caribbean islands. Some people say the Bahama Islands. So according to what I was taught by Miss Medill in grade 3, she said, so Christopher Columbus was looking for India. He thought he'd found India, and he saw these brown-skinned people, and he said, well, they must be Indians. That's one of those very silly stories that has nothing to do with reality. In 1492, there was no country called India in the world. There was a collection of principalities called Hindustan. So how do those stories get into our curriculum and our textbooks? And it's unfortunate, because when I said earlier that you students are among the first to learn many of these facts, the inclusive history of Canada, because unfortunately what there was in our textbooks before was pretty scant, didn't mention too much about Indigenous peoples, but occasionally mentioned things like that story about Columbus. So this is a typical scene, probably out west. You can see the Northwest Mounted Police officers wearing those pith helmets, and there would be treaty commissioners sitting in front of them, and they would be presenting, this would have been in the 1800s, they would have been presenting the terms of treaties proposed by the government. Might have been the federal government and provincial governments. There wasn't a Canada yet, likely, or just after there was a Canada. And they wanted land. And the treaty process had changed by this time. We're going to go back in time a bit in a few minutes to talk about what it started as. Unfortunately, by this time, they had turned the treaty process into a way to get land away from Indians. It was that simple. The number of settlers had grown exponentially. They outnumbered in most cases the Indigenous peoples whose way of life had been changed by everything from the War of 1812 and the losses they suffered, to ravages of disease like smallpox and influenza to which they had no immunity as the settler population increased, to deliberate government attempts to force them onto these little plots of land called reserves, by threatening them. One of the reasons that there is so much exception being taken to buildings or schools being named after Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, is that he deliberately had tactics that were designed to coerce Indians into giving their land up so that government could give it to settlers, expand the railway across what was becoming a coast-to-coast country. So this was how the process had evolved, not a pleasant process, but we'll go back a bit in time. And I don't know whether some of you have ever heard of, if you're secondary school students or teachers, of the Doctrine of Discovery. And this was a doctrine that was promulgated by the Roman Catholic Church, which was a mighty institution back in the 1400s and 1500s. And the church operated in very close political arenas with the crowned heads of Europe, and who all wanted their subjects to believe that they, as kings or queens, had a divine right to rule them. And one of the ways they ensured that was their continued impression they wanted to create was that they worked carefully with the church to the predominant church in Europe, and that included countries like Italy at that one time, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and they got the blessing of the church in their political and military actions. And as a result of that relationship, when the great explorations of the 14 and 1500s began by those European countries, they got the cooperation of the church, and the first pope being Pope Nicholas V in 1452. He was the first to issue a series of subsequent papal bulls. Those are declarations that it basically said that if these voyages from these countries go out anywhere in the world and they come across people in lands where they do not believe what we believe, in other words, Christianity generally, Catholicism particularly, you can treat their land as empty. And there was a Latin word for it, terra nullius. That was the empty land theory. And I like to show this map to show that these lands weren't empty at all. There were millions of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, and the population was decimated by, I mentioned earlier, diseases and other things brought by the Europeans. So there are far fewer than there used to be. But the land has never been empty. There are hundreds of nations of indigenous peoples across our continent and South America, all the way up to the Arctic, which has been inhabited by people they used to call Eskimos for centuries, millennia, and to the tip of Central America, where the Mayans and the Aztecs lived. So this has never been empty land. And unfortunately, that terra nullius and Doctrine of Discovery have never been, they've been on the books for over 500 years. They have never been rescinded. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, after he was elected, went to visit Pope Francis and asked if he would consider doing that. And he said no. And there have been church statements from sort of apologizing for any harm that was done by historic policies. But they have never agreed to literally remove the policy, even though it's over 500 years old. And one wonders if the reason they're concerned about doing that is that really racist doctrine isn't the underpinning of countries that were formed from colonized places, like Canada is, like many countries in Africa and Asia have been. If they're afraid of the legal ramifications, if they remove that doctrine. So, but it's still in place. And when these people came from these countries, as long as they came in peace and in friendship, they were welcomed by the many Indigenous peoples who were here. And there are countless stories about how they looked after these poor, pathetic people who, all of whom were refugees. They were refugees from, they didn't have religious freedom back in Europe. You could be burned at the stake if you said something like the earth goes around the sun, because that was contrary to the church's official belief. You could, you could be called into the army. You were more likely to be called into the army, which meant almost certain death if you were among the poor. Ordinary people, if you weren't part of the nobility that controlled and owned almost all the land in Europe, they lived like slaves. They called them serfs. And it was a horrible life. And I'm sure that many of them, however concerned they were about taking a voyage into the unknown by coming to a place that even the leaders of the expedition like Columbus had no idea where they were going or where they would end up, I'm sure it was a fate better than what they faced back home with poverty. And for hundreds of years, that was the way of life for most people, ordinary people in Europe. And Europe, of course, is very small for as a land base. It probably fits into Ontario with room to spare. So it was very small in land. What land there was controlled by very few people, nobility and kings and queens. And their population was much larger than in more wide open spaces like the Americas, where the Indigenous peoples had been the sole occupants. Here you see a sugar bush, and this is an engraving from a long time ago showing how the Indigenous people showed settlers that here is a way you could get sap out of these trees and out of it make a sweetener for your foods. And they shared everything from knowledge about where to get food, what food was available, how to hunt, what weapons to use, what do you do when winter comes. And many of these people came from places where they likely never saw snow or very much of it, and they had to know what a snowshoe was so they could move in the wintertime. They had to know how to travel in the water, and the Indians showed them how to make canoes. And there are countless stories of how almost certainly many, if not most settlers to this part of the world would have perished because of a climate they weren't used to, and would have starved to death. So the relationship, again, as long as it started peacefully, it remained that way. And the first settlers that came in any great numbers to start little settlements were from France. And you've heard the names of people like Jacques Cartier, who came up the St. Lawrence in 1534, names like Samuel Champlain, who came about 50 years later. And again, by and large, there was a very respectful relationship. They learned many things, survival techniques, the languages. They intermarried, the French, with Indigenous peoples. And they really discovered a great economic engine that drove the need for people to want to be in North America for well over a century, and that was the fur trade. And created fashion designs in Europe with these beaver furs and hats and coats, and that became a real source of prosperity. But the English and French, the people from Britain and the people from France had a long history of not getting along with one another and periodic wars, and probably directly related to the understanding that the French had stumbled upon a great source of land and resource wealth. They ended up in another war with the British called the 7 Years' War this time. And by the end of it, in about 1760, I think, in around there, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, you might have heard about near Quebec City, that really marked the end, for the time being, of that rivalry, and made the British the dominant European force in North America. And they had already started a colony south of what we know as Canada. It was becoming the 13 colonies, which would become the United States. And they started colonizing from the coast in to what was going to be Canada. But they knew that the Indigenous peoples were not like the Indigenous peoples they'd encountered in many places around the world, where they could just come in with military force and just take over and conquer the people. They saw evidence that the Indigenous peoples, the Indian tribes of North America, as they called them, would fight fiercely fight to defend their land. And after they had defeated the French, they had a meeting. Some of their generals, a man named Sir Geoffrey Amherst, met with a great leader, an Anishinaabe leader of the Odawa tribe called Pontiac. Obundiag was his name. And like many of the Indigenous peoples, they did not like the attitudes that the British demonstrated after over a century of friendly relationships and fair trading practices that had been demonstrated by the French who were settling. The British were very arrogant. And Sir Geoffrey Amherst is renowned for concocting a scheme to distribute blankets infected with smallpox among the Indigenous peoples. He objected to the practice of paying tribute to Indigenous peoples. And again, people who did not come onto Indigenous lands freely, they followed the practice that most European countries, most countries in the world practice, that if you're on someone else's territory, you pay, today we call them tolls or rent. I was talking to an elder from Treaty 3 the other day, and he said that the word in his language for treaty is a word that means leasing or renting. That arrangement, it wasn't selling, it was leasing. So when you cross someone's territory, you acknowledge it. And that's the origin, by the way, of the treaty recognitions that many of our schools are giving, is that you're acknowledging that you're on somebody else's territory. And with that came the giving of what they used to call presents or gifts. But if you rent an apartment, you don't give your landlord a gift or a present every month, you give them your rent. And that's what, that was the custom. And many of the British objected to that. They thought they were much more civilized. They were very arrogant. And so that relationship started to get very problematic. And this leader, Pontiac, with only a couple of hundred warriors, proceeded to capture 9 of the 12 British forts that were in what we now would call southwestern Ontario. This was an incredible shock to the British, who again were considered the mightiest empire militarily, and they had a huge navy with about 500 or 600 ships, and they had started colonies all around the world. And here was this one Indian chief with a little band of a couple of hundred Indians who captured something that the whole French army couldn't do, 9 of 12 British forts. So that helped create a different environment. And a man named Sir William Johnson, who is depicted here with yellow hair, he almost certainly had a gray powdered wig. He and other of King George III's economic and political and military advisors convinced the king that the way to hopefully have the more use of more land and access to some of the wealth in this new territory was to follow diplomacy. And the British, like other European nations, were used to treaties, and they thought, well, let's make a treaty with these Indigenous peoples. So the event that's pictured here on the cover of this book is the Treaty of Niagara meeting that took place near Niagara Falls, not under them, near it, and in the summer of 1764. And Sir William Johnson is pictured there giving a wampum belt, a woven like a tapestry of these sacred shell beads that would tell a story, in this case, the story of this treaty. And what started this process was the previous October, The King of England, on the advice of his advisors, proclaimed the Royal Proclamation, which said basically two things. It said that the Indian tribes of North America were to be regarded as nations, nations just like France, England, Spain, other countries. They were nations, and they had a title to their lands, and that no settlers were to interfere. The word they used in the proclamation was molest. They were not to interfere with Indigenous peoples on their lands. That if there was to be any attempt to secure lands from the Indians, that they had to have the Crown involved. And the Crown has always been, because Canada has been affiliated with the British Crown, and part of their first empire and now Commonwealth. We talk about our state as being the Crown. We talk about our provincial governments as being the Crown. We talk about prosecuting attorneys as being Crown attorneys. So we don't have a queen that rules us. The queen is our symbolic head of state, but the Crown is still that institution that represents this country called Canada. So, of course, they didn't have email in 1763, and they didn't have telephones or telegraphs. So they traveled. Sir William Johnson traveled back on this side of the Atlantic. His home was in what's now Upper New York State, on a huge estate. He lived with a woman called Molly Brant. The name Brantford is from her family and her brother Joseph Brant, who was a great Mohawk warrior. And she undoubtedly tutored her husband in the art of these wampum belts, which had been used by Mohawk people and others in the eastern part of North America at that time, well over a century. And she knew that because these wampum beads were made of shells that were considered sacred, that they would really carry great weight if her husband presented the treaty promises to the Indigenous leaders in wampum belts instead of just paper. So this great gathering, they sent runners. Sir William Johnson arranged for runners to go all around the Great Lakes and to contact the major nations of people who lived here and ask them if they would come to this big meeting at Niagara, at Fort Niagara in the following summer. So in July of 1764, the largest gathering in history of Indian chiefs and leaders took place here. This was never in any school book that I studied in all the 14 years of formal education I had. And it's just now starting to be taught. This was the beginning of the treaty process in Canada, the real beginning of it. And there were an estimated 3,000 Indian chiefs and headmen and leaders there. And they didn't have a big screen TV or microphone. So Sir William Johnson met with them over the course of the month of July 1764 in smaller council fires. There might have been a couple of hundred people that could hear. And he made these promises that went with these wampum belts that he showed them and gave them. And he said, among other things, he said, if you pick up this belt with the English, we will always be your ally, your friend. Your people will never be poor as long as the world exists. Now, these discussions would have taken place through translators, and the wampum belts helped explain, and their own people would have explained the teachings, the words that went with these belts, and they remembered. Their job was to remember these promises, and part of the treaty process was to get together annually, at least, and go over the treaty promises to remind one another of what the promises were. And again, because they were asking, the primary thing that they wanted this treaty to do was to gain a foothold in settlement. So they were asking these nations, and there were probably about 30 nations that were represented instead of the 24 that they thought were going to come. And they were asking them if they would share their lands. That was what they were there for, humbly beseeching. And they were humble because the Europeans were drastically outnumbered. There would be more Indigenous people at this gathering than there were European people in what we call Ontario. They were really outnumbered. So the newcomers knew how fierce they could defend their land, and they were greatly outnumbered. So they were very humble in this approach. And this was as positive as the relationship has ever been in the history of these lands between newcomers and Indigenous peoples. Perhaps it's just because they were greatly outnumbered. So, and in addition to making these promises, Sir William Johnson, he walked the talk. It wasn't just words. To prove that they were serious about the Indigenous peoples never being poor, he distributed, his diary says, about 13,000 gifts. And that would include guns and ammunition and pots and pans and ready-made blankets and needles and thread and cloth and tobacco and maybe some rum and all things that the Indigenous peoples didn't have. And in addition, he distributed among those leaders 6,000 pounds sterling. That's an amount of British money that today has the value of $20 million. I can't believe that the description of that meeting was never taught to most Canadians until the last decade. This event is when Canada started, not over 100 years later at Charlottetown or Quebec City, where people like Sir Johnny MacDonald got together and said, well, let's create a little country called Canada with 4 provinces. If they had not had permission from the Indigenous peoples to start sharing the use of the land over a century earlier, there wouldn't be a Canada, not the way we know it today. So I spend a lot of time on this slide because I believe that this is the most important event in this country's history. At the center of that Wampum Belt is this handshake, and the handshake is a universal symbol of friendship and peace and sharing. And you can see that in the Wampum Belt, the image shows that the figures have different hearts. Heart's very important to Indigenous peoples. In Ojibwe and Anishinaabemowin language, the word for truth literally translates, if we translate it literally in English, means to speak from your heart. So the handshake. And a quote up above that the Prime Minister of Canada said a few years ago that his government would fully implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's a more recent promise that hasn't been kept. One of those calls to action, I think 2 of them, I think numbers 46 and 47, talk about implementing the treaty relationship, renewing the treaty relationship. Because, as Sir William Johnson promised, those promises were to last forever. Treaties don't have expiry dates. They last forever. And contrary to what some people think, because they haven't learned these things in Canada's proper history, the treaties didn't give Indigenous peoples anything other than the annual tribute and rent. It was an agreement to share, and what the treaties did was recognize, as the Royal Proclamation did, that the Indigenous peoples had these rights, had this land. It was just affirming that, as does Canada's Constitution from 1982. When those, on the other side of this belt, and you'll see an image of it later on, you'll see other images that show that message of friendship. And a book that I talked about earlier, that Jody mentioned, Miss Williams mentioned, is it shows the people coming from Europe and arriving, and all the Indigenous peoples meeting them. They came in peace. They were welcomed in peace. These might even be Mi'kmaq people who were meeting them from the East Coast. And here we made a point in this book at underlining the fact that a treaty, whatever we think of it now, as I said earlier, it's a fancy word for a promise. And Canada, the country we call Canada, was founded on these promises. Here's an image showing, it's I think an American image showing at a treaty event, you can see a lot of paper there. The Indigenous peoples weren't so interested in paper. They couldn't speak English or write English. They at the word what interpreters told them was written down. Sometimes what was written down wasn't actually the truth. And you can see the Indian leader holding up a wampum belt, because that's what meant something to them, was the images on that belt. And on this is the Treaty of Niagara Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. On either side of the figures, one would represent the Indian tribes of North America, as they were called by the English. The other would represent the crown in what was going to be Canada. And you can see links there. That's links of a chain. You can see the date, 1764. Only really historic belts had dates woven into them. This belt has 10,076 beads in it. The original belt size is about 6 feet long and about 1.5 feet wide. And it would have taken, in those days before they had metal tools, before they got them as gifts at treaty gatherings from people like the British, they said it would take a native woman as long as 2 days to complete one polished bead. They had to chip it out of a shell. I don't know whether you can see it on the screen. That's a quahog shell, one of the shells that they used. Half of it, by the way, the other half would have been the same, and it would have had a meat like a scallop in it. And they cut the chunks out of those shells and polished them to make these beads. They had to be identical size, and they would string them horizontally and vertically, just like you would weave cloth, and make these wonderful stories, documents that they called belts. And they had been making them for hundreds of years before Europeans were here. And the Europeans, as I said, came to understand how important they were, so they copied that practice. You can see all the treaties going across Canada. There's some areas of treaties, some parts of Quebec, some parts of British Columbia that in which treaties weren't agreed to. I would argue that because the Royal Proclamation was addressed to the Indian tribes of North America, that all of the benefits and promises in those treaties are made to all of the Indian tribes of North America. But I mentioned earlier that after that wonderful start of the relationship, possibly it was wonderful because the Indians greatly outnumbered the newcomers, the treaty process began to be less honorable. And by the time the Indians became weak because of disease and loss in warfare, like the War of 1812, the government started this process almost preceding settlement. They would send commissioners across the country. These are called the numbered treaties, and they just wanted to get the land away out of the Indian hands. They didn't want to have to negotiate, and they deployed a lot of dishonorable tactics. And but you have to remember that, and in some cases, what they would have to promise, because the Indigenous ancestors were pretty tough negotiators. And in Treaty 6, for example, they extracted a promise from the government that they would always have a medicine chest. That's healthcare. The Supreme Court of Canada says the Indian treaties today must be interpreted the way they were understood at the time by the Indians. Treaty 6 also promised a schoolhouse. That's universal education for Indigenous people. Sometimes farm implements, other things. They didn't just take what was offered. They still had some bargaining power, but they were weakened considerably. In some cases, literally starving. The government withheld food rations from them at Sir John A. Macdonald's order. But the process, as you can see, became totally unlike how it had started. There isn't one square centimeter of land in the province of Ontario that isn't under treaty. There are something like 46 treaties here. You people, most of you are down in what they call land surrenders. And words like that, well, I'll show you that in a minute. I mentioned Treaty 6. This is a medal that the Indian chiefs often were given medals after their nations had signed, or I don't use the word signed, you'll see why in a minute, had agreed to treaty terms. And there's usually an image of a treaty commissioner representing the crown on the left, an Indian chief on the right. Most important thing, you can see teepees behind them on the right, but the most important image is the sun, because the promises were always that these promises will last as long as the sun shines, as long as the sun rises in the east. And the treaty commissioners, including Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, 1836, noticed that that an Indian's word, when formally pledged, is one of the strongest moral securities on earth. They kept their promises. There wouldn't be too many Indians who would say the same thing about representatives of the crown these days. And this was a typical treaty. This involves my community of Alderville, where if you look in fine print, it talks about surrendering the land. There was no word in Indigenous languages for surrender or sell the land. And they were told orally that they were agreeing to share the use of land that they had always lived on, that they would always be allowed to hunt and fish the way they always had, and that they were going to, in some cases, create special lands just for them, reserves, but that they would not lose their hunting and fishing rights. And that settlers were going to come, if they agreed, settlers would come on some of these areas that are mentioned in the treaty. This is important because I want you to look at the names, who are the names of the chiefs who are said to have signed this agreement. And one of the reasons of 1856, and this is the reason I say they didn't sign it, because they couldn't read or write. They accepted the translation and the promises that were made to them. In many cases, the promises were not even included in the written document, but added in later. In many cases, unfortunately, they were lied to. Some treaties like mine, the Williams Treaty, was just resolved a couple of years ago after 95 years. And part of the reason was that the Indians weren't allowed to have lawyers to help them understand what the treaties contained. It's a fairly modern treaty, 1923. But you can see all the handwriting of the names of the chiefs is written by the same person, the same handwriting. That would have been a clerk, a government clerk. And how they approved the terms, as they were explained to them, was they would sign their clan symbol. It could be a deer, a moose, an elk, a lynx. There's a bird there. If I had have been asked to approve that treaty, I would have drawn a little muskrat or a wolf, depending on what the treaty was. At the side, it says seal, so the government would have put a big blob of red wax there and stamped it with the government seal, so that made it official. But you can see how these, how the ways that Canada started acquiring land were less than, as I told one class, one group of teachers, if Judge Judy, I'm sure some of you have seen Judge Judy on TV, if she was, if this document was put in front of her and said, this is how all of these Indigenous peoples, quote, sold their land, Judge Judy would throw that case right out of her court, as have done many of the real courts today. Those are wampum belts, the two big belts. You can see the belt with 64 at one end. They're hanging over a pole. That was the Treaty of Niagara Covenant chain belt, that symbol of friendship. The symbol was to represent a silver chain. At those annual treaty meetings, they were supposed to polish the chain because friendship can be tarnished unless you polish it. The medal next to it, the belt next to it shows 24 figures. Those were to represent the 24 nations of Indians that they thought were going to show up at that big gathering. They couldn't obviously amend the belt quickly when 30 showed up. And that belt promised that at one end it showed the land, which was Canada. The other end was a ship. And Sir William Johnson promised that all you have to do is pull on that rope that joins you together, and at the other end is our ship, and it will bring anything you need. That was a very metaphorical way of saying that the gifts that he was giving, the presents he was giving, the rent that the British were paying at Niagara, that was the sort of thing that was going to happen from now on if the Indigenous peoples agreed to share their land. Now, there was another aspect to treaties that's very, very important. there's a sacred aspect to the treaties. That Wampum Belt was called the covenant chain. Covenant is a word for a sacred relationship. And the pipe and sacred tobacco, not that poisonous stuff that they sell in stores, causes addictions and all sorts of bad illnesses. Smoking the pipe meant that you were actually praying, and the indigenous people's custom was that any promises or pledges you made when you were smoking that pipe with them meant that you were promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And all the promises you had made were going to be heard by the Creator, by God. So they couldn't imagine anybody would break any promise made like that. They couldn't imagine that. That wasn't in their understanding at all. But that made it more than a legally binding agreement. That made it a sacred agreement. So the promises at Niagara were first put to the test about 40 years later, when the only war ever fought on Canadian soil took place. It was called the War of 1812, as some of you know, many of you know. And it was an invasion of what was going to be Canada. It was Upper Canada at the time, by the United States, who had decided about 20 years earlier they didn't want to be a colony of Britain anymore. They wanted to have their own country, and they wanted the land that was in Canada to join them. And the problem was many of the people here, even some of the people down there in what was becoming the United States, didn't want to leave Britain. And the bigger problem for people like Sir Isaac Brock, who was the political and military leader in Upper Canada, was that there were virtually no soldiers here, no British soldiers. Most of them were back in Europe because, once again, the British and the French were fighting. This time a guy named Napoleon was trying to conquer Europe. So Sir Isaac Brock had made alliances with Indigenous leaders, in particular a man named Tecumseh. And they, Sir Isaac Brock was killed early in the war near Niagara Falls, where there's a huge monument to him today, 180 feet tall. There's no monuments to the Indigenous leaders who helped fend off this invasion of a much larger army. There were about 10,000 Indigenous warriors. Most of them were Anishinaabe from up north here, people like Pakinawattik, Siganak, Meskwaki, Ashawanu, Shawundas. Those are great Canadian war heroes. You have never seen their names in a book. Hopefully someday they will. You will see a statue of Isaac Brock, who was called the Hero of Upper Canada. But those men I just mentioned to you played a greater role right through the whole 2 years plus of the war. Sir Isaac Brock unfortunately died early in the war. Tecumseh died the following year. But he was a great proponent of the Indigenous peoples across the Americas joining together, because he saw how the settlers were starting to push west, particularly in what was becoming the United States. So the Indians kept their promise. They said they'd always be friends and allies of the British. They kept their promise here. When people ask who won the War of 1812, the Americans still say they won. They talk about the Battle of New Orleans, at which General Andrew Jackson defeated the British at New Orleans. The war had been over for a number of weeks when that battle was fought, so it didn't matter. And the two sides agreed to pretty well keep the same boundaries. So the Canadians, the people who defended Canada, won. That was primarily the Indigenous peoples who this cartoon character says we lost, because they suffered the most casualties, because they were the biggest part of Canada's army. Their 10,000 warriors were up against forces of about 50 or 60,000 Americans. But again, as I said earlier, the reason that there was such a healthy respect for the Indigenous peoples is they fought pretty fiercely. So we know what the British, the Crown got. They got their lands and settlements defended. They got a share of the lands. And what did the Indigenous peoples get? What promises were kept? Well, you remember that slide that showed all of the land being occupied by Indigenous peoples? Here we are a couple of hundred years later, and Indigenous peoples in Canada, First Nations peoples, their official land base, the reserves, there are about 600 of them. They're those little dots. That's all that's left. It's 0.2% of Canada's land base. Up north, that's Iqaluit, Nunavut, I should say, where it's mostly ice and snow. So you can see what happened to the land, partly because people like Canada's first Prime Minister, as I said earlier, was trying to get the land away from them. You could see that by his comment here. They wanted, in this case, to extinguish the land titles. So he's agreeing they had titles in rich farm country as Saskatchewan became. And around the same time, an Indian chief is lamenting what's happened. He said, you know, when your people came here, we nursed you, we protected you, we showed you how to survive. And when you became a mighty tree, after we helped you do that, you lashed us with your branches. And that's what's happened, what's starting to happen in Canada to the Indigenous peoples about the same time as Canada takes pride in saying they established a country. The Indian Act came into effect very soon after Confederation, which did not treat Indigenous peoples as persons. They still were regarded as savages. They didn't get to vote in federal or provincial elections until about 1960, about 100 years later. By the way, women didn't get to vote. They weren't regarded as persons in Canada until about 1930, I think. The Indian Act still exists. It's been changed very little. It determines the blood quantum, who can claim they're an Indian in the eyes of the government of Canada. They have such ridiculous content in the act. For example, technically, if you die and you live on a reserve and you have a will, that your will has to be probated by a government official in Ottawa. If you want to spray for weeds in the ditches on your First Nation on your reserve, technically the band council has to pass a bylaw that has to be approved by somebody in Ottawa. The Indian Act at one point said that if you went off the reserve, you had to have a pass signed by the Indian agent, who was a government employee, and saying when you were coming back and saying why you were going. And if you were caught off the reserve in such a horrible place as a pool hall, a billiard parlor, you could go to jail, and the person who owned the pool hall could lose their license. It was treating Indigenous peoples like children. And when you do that for 100 years, you remove a lot of self-esteem and entrepreneurship and other things. And it's taken that long for a lot of changes to happen for the better. They were trying to eradicate Indigenous culture. You could go to jail for doing what you see at powwows now, doing sacred traditional dances and singing and drumming. You were not allowed. The first thing they did when the students went to residential schools was cut their hair off and remove any traditional clothing. The potlatch is a system, a very wonderful ceremony, primarily out west, where people who had accumulated a lot of personal wealth would share it with everybody in their community. They would give it all away. That was considered a very wrong thing to do. Sharing was considered wrong by the people who had asked Indians to share their land with them. Residential schools were the worst part of what happened with the Indian Act and the breach of treaties. I don't talk a lot about this because I'm not a survivor. My grandfather ran away from what was called an industrial training school before the network of residential schools started. He ran away when he was 8 and taught himself how to read and write over the years. Many Indigenous kids tried to run away. 150 schools operated across Canada for about 150 years. There's still 80,000 people alive who went to those schools. The last one didn't close until 1996. One thing we do know is that 6,000 children at least died while they were at those schools. Many of their parents didn't know, were never notified. They don't know where they're buried. if you can imagine your parents sending you off to school and not knowing whether they were ever going to see you again, that was fairly common, because 1 in 24 Native children that went to residential schools, so far, the total show, 1 in every 24 died there. That means that it was statistically more dangerous for a Native child to be at residential school than it was to be a Canadian soldier in World War II. The odds of that soldier surviving were greater than the odds of those Native kids surviving by going to residential school. Horrible chapter in Canadian history, and it's something that everybody should know about, and it's being taught for the first time now to students like you. And you have to ask yourself, why wasn't this taught before? That's a very important question. Why wasn't it taught before? So this is a week in which we're remembering things. It's Remembrance Day. I think all important things we should remember every day, not just one day a year. Like most Indigenous peoples, many Indigenous peoples have ceremonies every day in which they give thanks for everything they have. So Thanksgiving isn't just having a turkey one day a year for a lot of Indigenous peoples. It's every day, being grateful for all we have. And the same way, we never forget, hopefully not just one day a year, remember that many people were willing to give up their lives, and many thousands of people died so that mostly in foreign wars, so that Canada could be free and other countries around the world. And as I said, in the War of 1812, Indigenous peoples were keeping their treaty promises by defending their lands and what was going to be Canada. And that is not just a historic commitment. In the First World War, the greatest war in the world to that point, involved countries all around the world. Corporal Francis Pegamagabo from Wasauksing First Nation, when he came back, he was the chief of his community. He was one of the very few soldiers in the British Empire to be awarded the Military Medal for Bravery 3 times. He was a sniper, and he was good at using his rifle, because in those days, at home, there were no grocery stores. If you wanted to eat, you had to hunt it or fish for it. So most Indians were pretty good with rifles. Sergeant Tommy Prince was from Broken Head Indian Reserve in Manitoba, was one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers in World War II and in the Korean War. And we've had many, still today, there are many Indigenous soldiers that are in uniform defending Canada, and you'll see them at the powwows. Today, as Jody mentioned, this is yesterday officially was National Aboriginal Veterans Day. Some people now, they've changed the Aboriginal to Indigenous. There's a special monument, so because of the specific roles that Indigenous peoples played as far back as 1812 in defending Canada. And they have defended, even though their population was only a small portion of Canada's population, they volunteered in much greater percentages than other Canadians did. So this monument was erected, and you can see an eagle at the top, which is an important Indigenous symbol. And you can see a bear, and the bear is a great protector, peacekeeper. And at the right, you see a big monument that was built to commemorate, in my home community in Alderville, the men and women who wore Canadian uniforms to defend Canada in the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and since. Their names are all there. I have 3 uncles and a great uncle whose names are on that monument. My grandfather, Moses Muskrat Marsden's name is there. He was too old when the First World War took place, but he started a military band that helped promote the war effort and improve spirits of the people at home. To give you an idea of the extent to which First Nations people have supported, and Métis and Inuit people have defended Canada, at the time of the First World War, when they were looking to build a Canadian army to fight with as part of the British contingent, there were 63 adult men living in Alderville, and 38 of them volunteered for service, including my great uncle Robert Franklin, who came home and spent many of his remaining years in a military hospital in Toronto because he had suffered the effects of mustard gas, which has since been outlawed by the Geneva Convention. So, so it's time to remember. And remember when I said that the treaties were supposed to, when they were originally conceived in Canada, they were supposed to have annual meetings and talk about the promises and distribute what they called presents, or I call rent or toll or tribute. This is I think Treaty 9 up Northern Ontario, I think. And the mounted police is always there. It's in this black and white picture, and you can see that gentleman getting a sum of money, some banknotes. And unfortunately, they haven't bothered for many years to polish the chain and to repeat the promises that were made, because it's probably too embarrassing for the government to repeat the promises. So they give out money, and in some cases, the money would be an annuity that was agreed to, an annual payment that was agreed to as part of the treaty. There might have been some money paid up front for the so-called land surrenders. So here's a current day treaty day. And you can see a woman signing. She would be one of the descendants of the original Indian treaty holders. And you can see the mounted policemen still there, and those people who would be doling out the money would be representatives of the government, probably from Indian Affairs Canada. And I just will give you an example of what's happened to those treaty promises. The Robinson-Huron Treaty was agreed to in 1850, and it affected 21 First Nations. And the treaty came into effect because the government was working with industry to try to open up land for mining in Northern Ontario, north of Lake Huron. And the chiefs of those 21 communities negotiated an agreement that, among other things, called for an increase, a share of the wealth that would come from the settlers, and an increase in it. So when the wealth increased, they would get a share of the increase. And in 1850, each member of those 21 First Nations got $2 a year. $2 was a good sum in those days. And then a few years later, it was increased to, I think in 1876, it was increased to $4 a year. And it has not changed in the 160 years since. $4 a year is what that lady is I think, going to get, two toonies. And that's despite the fact that the treaty said that they were to receive an increase in any wealth that came from their territories in exchange for agreeing to share them. And that case, like so many others, has gone to court. And the First Nations have won the first two parts of it. The government of Ontario has appealed the finding of the judge, but they're going to be moving into a phase where they rule on how much those payments are going to be that have not increased in the last 160 years. And out of those lands that the treaties shared have been companies, just one, I'll name just one of dozens. It used to be called Inco. It's now called Vale Inco. It's a South American company. And they estimate that one company that they have taken trillions of dollars out of that, what they call the Sudbury Basin mining. And that adds up to a lot more than $4 a year for the people who shared the land. I always try to include in any presentation I give that Indigenous peoples, regardless of challenges that we've faced, whether they're residential schools or broken treaty promises, that we've always continued to contribute to Canada, whether it's defending Canada, whether it's in other fields like sports. You've all heard of maybe Carey Price, the goalie of the Montreal Canadiens, is a great artist, and from Sudbury, Leyland Bell. Jody Wilson-Raybould was the Justice Minister of Canada. Dr. Nadine Caron is a Métis surgeon. Those are just a few of dozens and dozens and dozens of Indigenous peoples who continue to contribute to make Canada better, even though the promises to them were broken. And when I meet in person with people, I always ask everybody, please put up your hand if you have treaty rights. And you remember we talked earlier about we are all treaty people. We all have treaty rights. Both in that famous handshake figure, the people representing non-Indigenous newcomers to Canada and the people who've been here forever. We all share the rights of those treaties, and you share, arguably non-Indigenous peoples are enjoying their treaty rights and Indigenous peoples aren't, because non-Indigenous peoples live in cities that have paved roads and hospitals, and they've used the land to put up schools, and they all have safe drinking water. But the Indigenous peoples who made that possible by agreeing to share the land, many of them don't have any of those things. They don't have schools, many of them. They don't have drinking water. Many of them are living in poverty, which is why the majority of First Nations people have moved into cities, because the reserves are, my grandfather left his reserve in the 1920s because he didn't see any future there for him, because those promises hadn't been kept. We hope, and this is a little custom I know over the years, that people who make a promise will cross the fingers of their other hand to mean that they're not really necessarily going to keep the promise. So we hope those treaty handshakes weren't made like that. But we wonder when we see things happening like out east, where the Mi'kmaq fishermen who have tried to exercise their treaty rights to fish for lobster year round, as their treaty promised in 1762 or 1752, I think it was, as part of the first treaties that were signed with newcomers. The treaty rights are upheld by the Constitution, Canada's highest law, and by subsequent Supreme Court decisions upholding the Mi'kmaq right. And you can see this MP, who happens to be a Mi'kmaq citizen, say that it looks like politicians are more interested in doing what their voters tell them than many of those voters don't even know about treaty rights because they didn't take it in school. The Constitution, as you can see, the wording on the right says that the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. That's the highest law in the land. And on the other side of the Canadian coat of arms is a quote from the Queen, who is our symbolic head of state, who during a visit in 2005 reminded her listeners that her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, whose picture's on the other side of those treaty medals, many of them, that she understood that the treaties were reflected the foundation of the rights of First Nations peoples in this country. So education is a great part in learning about these things, and I have shared these Wampum Belts discussions about them. There's two school teachers from Southern Ontario across from me. I can't remember where they were from. It might have been the Oshawa area. And this was at a powwow in Curve Lake, which is near, not far from Peterborough. And again, I want to reiterate that the gifts that our ancestors, our first ancestors, were told we should bring to this world to have a good life, I would hope that the day comes when the respect for the treaty relationship, the honesty, the truth in it, the promises, the sharing that was promised, and that those things will last forever. I hope that is how the treaty process evolves. And if anybody's going to make sure that's the way the treaty process evolves from what it is right now, it's going to be you young people who are going to be the prime ministers, the judges who interpret the laws, the teachers who are going to be teaching it, and the journalists who tell the public about it. And you're going to have those jobs. And I hope things are changed, that we aren't talking in the days when you were holding those jobs about how so many treaty promises have not been kept, that they are broken. So I'm going to leave it there, and I thank you for your attention. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Morris, for sharing this with us this afternoon. I'm sure the people attending can appreciate like there's the amount of knowledge. I always consider you're almost like a walking encyclopedia with the amount of knowledge that you carry. And I meant to also mention to the viewers that one of your most recent jobs was that you're a commissioner with the Human Rights Commission. So, it's a real treat to have you with us today and going over so much of this information that is really crucial for learning about. So I know we are very close to the end of time, but if there are any questions that you would like to put in the chat box at this time, we would invite you to do that. And I will ask a few that have come up already. So one of the questions here is, how many treaties are there today? Now, I guess that depends on where, and there's some complication between how some people define treaties. So that's a question that's come up.
Well, there are 46 recognized treaties in the province of Ontario and alone. And again, as Jody says, it depends how you interpret them, because the government had this way of referring to some of these so-called agreements as surrenders or cessions, or so there's some Indigenous people that aren't too crazy about them being considered treaties, but the government of Canada is recognizing that there are at least 70 treaties entered into across the country. And again, some of them are more modern than others, but it doesn't matter whether they were agreed to yesterday or 250 years ago. They are the promises that were made according to the non-Indigenous people who wanted the treaties were to last forever. No expiry date.
Okay, another question here. There was a question that came up while you were talking, and I'm not sure at what point this was, but it was you had referenced that there was a bylaw that had been removed. I'm wondering if that was when you were talking about the Indian Act.
Yeah. I think I mentioned that there were a number of really strange things in the Indian Act, some of which had been removed. One of them is that the government decreed that Indigenous peoples should not, under any circumstances, enter a pool hall. But there are still technically many things that again, technically, if you went by the current wording of the Indian Act, there haven't been that many changes in it. That technically you would have to get permission from First Nation would have to get permission from Ottawa to spray for weeds. So there's still many silly things in there, but the biggest thing is that it gives under the current legislation, it gives the government of Canada the right to declare who is an Indigenous person, and that's they don't declare anybody else's citizenship. But they reserve the right to declare indigeneity, and and it becomes really bizarre because it's intermarriage or multiple marriages is quite a common thing now because of a lot of marriages end up in separation or divorce. So in everybody's society, so it's not uncommon in First Nations communities to have brothers and sisters. Some of them have Indian status, as they call it. Some of them don't, and it's just a nightmare of bureaucracy that's involved in these things. And there was never any discussion when the treaties were first envisioned that any foreign government or settler government would determine who was an Indian. That's up to Indians, the same as it's up to Canadians to determine who their citizens are. It's up to First Nations to determine who their citizens are. But we find ourselves negotiating these things in meetings with the government.
So another question here is about the material used to make wampum belts.
Well, I showed this shell, and that's a quag shell, they pronounce it. And but there were wampum belts at different times, particularly I guess with people before these, and this became almost an industry in the Maritimes in New England. The factories, after a time, they saw how important these beads were. And at one time, Europeans, because they didn't have currency from Europe, at one time they used pieces of wampum as exchange. But the extracting, at one time I started to say that the wampum was made from pieces of eagle talons or even quills from porcupines to look like beads. I laugh when I think there was a school in Guelph where the teacher didn't have the materials she needed, and the kids were making wampum belts out of pieces of macaroni, which I thought was interesting. It's good practice as long as the learners also learned about the importance of these belts not being just beading projects, that they're sacred items. The shell became to be the most common, and extracting those beads and polishing them and putting holes in them was an extremely time-consuming job, as long as 2 days, they said, for each bead, which it really shows how important they were. And I didn't mention earlier that those quahog shells, scientists now know that those shells are among the oldest living creatures. Those creatures, quahogs, they pronounce it quag in the Maritimes, Quahog, and they have found living quags over 500 years old. So one wonders if our ancestors didn't think what a good thing to make agreements out of, wampum belts out of, that were supposed to last forever, if you make them actually out of the material that came from some of the oldest living creatures.
We'll just do maybe a couple more questions because we are really getting to the end of time here, but there's several in here. I always feel bad not being able to get to all the questions. Here's one. Were First Nations invited to the table during the signing of the 1982 Canadian Constitution? That's a great question.
Not really. There was a lot of discussion about the Constitution, and Section 35, that was, there probably would have been a lot of serious demonstrations and civil disobedience if that Section 35 that I included in my second last slide hadn't been included. There was a lot of discussion about repatriating the Constitution and language rights and everything else, but it took a lot of negotiating of Indigenous people across the country. Some of them came in a constitutional train, traveling coast to coast to express their concern. And so the government, in its wisdom, at least added something. I thought the question was going to be after the War of 1812, in which they were the main combatants, were the Indigenous peoples invited to the table, and they weren't. The Treaty of Ghent, that marked the end of the War of 1812, that mainly had been fought by the Indigenous peoples on Canada's side, weren't even invited to the treaty, and despite all the promises that had been made to them. So it's not uncommon for Indigenous peoples not to be at the table. Governments have usually taken the position that they're going to do things for Indigenous peoples instead of with us. And that attitude still exists to a large extent. And we hope it's going to change, but we haven't. It's not uncommon for pieces of legislation about us to be introduced without us really having a say in it. And sometimes old habits die hard.
One other question here was in regards to your grandpa. How did he escape?
He just ran away. Thank you for asking. And he didn't talk about it. Many people who go through unpleasant experiences, including people who were in war, don't talk about it because so his family didn't know much about it. All we knew is that when he was about 8 years old, he ran away and he had to teach himself how to read and write. Many kids that went to some of those schools, the residential schools or the forerunners to those schools, had to hide. Their parents would hide them in the bush. Um, so it's unfortunate, but I can understand. There was a great author and teacher named Basil Johnson, who's one of the most famous Anishinaabe scholars in our history. And he went to residential school, and he didn't tell his wife, his closest confidant, for almost 40 years of his experience at residential school. That's how that's how much influence that has on your existence. So I'm lucky my grandfather escaped, because if he ran away, because if he hadn't, I wouldn't be here, and neither would 71 other grandchildren.
Well, we are very grateful that that happened, because we were very grateful to have you here with us today. And we have come to the end of our time. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions, but keep inquiring, going, whether you're a student or a teacher, keep asking those questions, and keep looking into this, and researching and reaching out. That it's really important we continue these conversations. That, as Morris had said earlier, this is the first time that we're really seeing this new education happening in our schools across the province. So it's definitely a learning journey that everyone is going on together. So I just want to thank you again, Morris, for spending this afternoon with us and sharing with us these important contributions that you had mentioned by Indigenous peoples, and that we continue to look for ways to, as a call to action, we'll put that back out on the students and teachers listening in today, your call to action in, number one, getting informed, and number two, calling out the injustices that are still going on every single day. When the governments continue to break their own laws, that we speak out collectively as a society, so that the future is going to look a little bit better for our grandchildren down the road. So I'll just invite you, Morris, if you have any last words that you want to share with us today.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much again for the invitation, Jody, and for all. Again, I'm grateful that all of the however many students. How many classes have we got? Do we know?
It's tough to say.
Yeah.
I'm going to say there was approximately, there's well over 200 classes. I'd have to go back and look at. I wasn't.
So that's I'm so grateful. We're talking about thousands of people, and
yes,
and that's wonderful, and I'm so grateful that you and your teachers took the time, and again, it's important to, in a country like Canada, that is one of the greatest places, if not the greatest place in the world, we always have to make sure that everybody who lives here, that their rights are upheld. Because the danger, if you don't uphold one person's rights, and governments think that that's okay, then maybe next time it's your rights that are diminished. And so everybody's rights, doesn't matter where they are in that medicine wheel, everybody's rights are important. So you're our future, and I thank you again, and wish you good health and much happiness, and be safe. Go ahead.
And thank you again for everyone who has been listening in, tuning in today. Very appreciative to have you join with us. Hopefully you will join us again in the future when we offer more sessions. So stay tuned for that. Take care, everyone.